The morning light over Northgate City was pale and cold, the kind that made the glass towers look like frozen monuments. Officer Kira Sloan adjusted her body camera, the small red light blinking on her vest like a heartbeat. She had done this routine hundreds of times: patrol, report, repeat. But today, something in the air felt heavy. Across the street, a man in a dark suit walked toward the courthouse steps. He carried a leather briefcase, worn but polished, the kind of object that told stories of long service. Kira's gaze narrowed. Something about him, his pace, his silence, triggered that buried instinct, the one drilled into her through years of threat recognition training. She touched her earpiece. Control, Unit 47 checking perimeter. Possible suspicious individual near courthouse front. No one answered immediately. She could hear the buzz of morning traffic, the hum of life beginning. Then a voice replied. "Copy that, 47. Proceed with caution." The man stopped at the steps, reaching into his jacket slowly, too slowly for Kira's liking. Her pulse jumped. She stepped forward, hand resting on the grip of her taser. "Sir, step back from the entrance." The man froze, confusion flickering across his calm features. "Officer, I work here. I can show my..." Kira never let him finish. Training, fear, and memory collided in a single flash. For a second, the sunlight hit his skin, a deep brown tone that reflected differently through the courthouse glass. Something ancient stirred in Kira's mind, an image, a headline, 1,000 officer safety briefings featuring faces that looked like his. A reflex older than thought. "Hands where I can see them," she barked. He obeyed, slow and steady, pulling out a small wallet. Inside was a government ID. But she barely glanced at it. In that split second of glare and shadow, all Kira saw was a shape her training had taught her to fear. The briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the stone. And in that heartbeat, everything began to unravel. The briefcase hit the stone with a hollow sound, papers scattering like white birds startled into flight. Judge Malcolm Hayes, though Kira didn't know his name yet, raised his hands higher, the sunlight catching on the edge of his silver wristwatch. "Officer, please," he said evenly. "If you'll allow me to reach for my identification." But Kira's adrenaline had already taken command. The old instincts, sharpened by years of fear-based training, had drawn their own conclusions long before reason could intervene. "Step back," she ordered, moving closer. Around them, commuters slowed, sensing something unfolding. Cameras in the square blinked silently, recording every frame of what was about to change both their lives. Kira reached out, grabbed his wrist, and twisted it behind his back. The man gasped but didn't resist. His voice remained calm, almost heartbreakingly calm. "Officer, you're making a mistake." Her handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, metal on skin, the sound of finality. "I said don't move. You have no business here." She pressed him against the cold wall of the courthouse. In that moment, the difference between officer and suspect became a script, not a truth, one written long ago by people who'd never met either of them. For a heartbeat, Kira thought she was keeping the world safe. For Judge Hayes, it felt like the world had just declared war on his dignity. From the top of the courthouse steps, a security guard called out, startled by the commotion. "Officer! What's going on?" "Possible imposter," Kira barked. He tried to access the building with forged documents. The guard frowned, his eyes flicking to the man's face. There was something unsettlingly familiar about him, but protocol froze him in place. "Check his bag," Kira ordered. She knelt, unzipping the briefcase. Inside, court memos, legal briefs, embossed seals, everything neat and authentic. But her eyes didn't process any of it. Her mind filtered what she saw through years of quiet bias and tired suspicion. "Yeah," she muttered. "Looks like fake paperwork." Judge Hayes closed his eyes, the humiliation pressing him like a weight. He had sentenced corrupt officers before. He had written opinions on civil rights. But now, none of that mattered. "Officer," he said softly, "this is my courthouse." "Sure it is," she replied flatly. "And I'm the Queen of England." The line drew nervous laughter from one of the younger patrol officers who had wandered over. The sound echoed against the marble walls like the faintest crack in something sacred. And above them, the bronze plaque read, "United States Courthouse, the Honorable Malcolm L. Hayes, presiding." But Kira didn't look up. She was too busy making sure the man in cuffs stayed exactly where she thought he belonged. The holding room smelled of metal and paper, the sterile scent of bureaucracy and consequence. Judge Malcolm Hayes sat on a narrow bench, his wrists still cuffed, though the handcuffs now seemed almost symbolic. He had faced murderers, corporate titans, and corrupt politicians, but he had never sat here, on the other side of justice. Through the small glass window, he could see Officer Kira Sloan speaking to the desk sergeant. Her movements were sharp, efficient, the confidence of someone who had never been told she was wrong. "Subject attempted to enter the courthouse with forged credentials," she said briskly. "Claims he's a judge. I think we've got a fraud case on our hands." The sergeant didn't even look up. "Standard processing?" "Yeah. Let's book him, and I'll finish the report." Hayes could hear every word. His pulse stayed steady, but something inside him ached, not from fear, but from recognition. He had heard this script before. Dozens of times. Spoken by other officers. Written in other reports. And he had believed them. He closed his eyes. 23 years on the bench. He had sworn to uphold the Constitution, to protect both law and liberty. But the law, he realized, was only as just as the people who enforced it. Kira's radio crackled. "Unit 47, confirms suspect's identity before transfer." Her jaw tightened. She hated when dispatch questioned her judgment. "Already confirmed. Paperwork's fake. The guy's delusional." She looked back through the window. The man's calmness unsettled her, not defiant, not scared, just steady. It was the kind of composure that comes from someone who had spent their life controlling chaos. For the first time, doubt whispered at the edge of her thoughts. What if he's telling the truth? But she pushed it down, the way she always had. Doubt, she'd been taught, was dangerous. It made you hesitate. And hesitation, in her line of work, could get you killed. Across the room, Sergeant Mills adjusted his glasses, glancing toward the file on his desk. "Sloan, you said he had court documents?" "Yeah. Dozens of them. All official looking. Classic scam setup." Mills frowned. "You sure about that?" Kira's reply was automatic. "Positive. People like him don't walk into courthouses with real paperwork." The phrase hung in the air, "people like him." Mills didn't comment, but the look in his eyes said he'd heard it too many times before. Back inside the holding room, Hayes exhaled slowly. The fluorescent light above him flickered, throwing faint shadows across the gray walls. He had once written a judicial opinion on systemic bias in law enforcement. He'd quoted data, precedent, reform proposals. Now, he didn't need data, he was the evidence. He looked at his reflection in the glass, the bruised cheek, the silver in his hair, the brown of his skin that seemed to decide everything before he ever spoke. And outside, Officer Sloan was writing his story for him. Suspect resisted questioning. Possible mental instability. The report was almost finished. The damage already done. But fate, like justice, had a strange sense of timing. Because at that very moment, across the street, a courthouse clerk recognized the briefcase, the same one she'd seen every morning for years. And the machinery of truth began, quietly, to turn. Down the hall, the courthouse clerk Angela Whitmore adjusted her glasses as she scanned the security feed. She wasn't supposed to be watching, but curiosity, and a flicker of disbelief, held her still. On the screen, she saw him, the man in the holding room, sitting upright despite the handcuffs, his expression calm, almost dignified. Her heart skipped. She'd seen that same man every morning for 10 years, greeting staff with a nod as he entered his chambers. "That's Judge Hayes," she whispered. Angela bolted from her chair, heels echoing down the marble corridor. In the booking office, Kira was finishing her report when the door burst open. "Officer Sloan." Angela gasped. "What are you doing?" "That's Judge Hayes." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed to pause. Kira blinked, confused. "I'm sorry, who?" "Judge Malcolm L. Hayes. Federal judge, he's presided here for over 20 years. The words hit Kira like ice water. For a moment, the entire world narrowed to a single ringing in her ears. Her mind scrambled through images, the papers she hadn't read, the IDs she hadn't checked, the plaque she hadn't noticed. "That can't be right," she whispered. But Angela was already pulling out her phone. "Look!" She showed the courthouse staff photo, the same man, same calm face, same eyes. "That's him." Sergeant Mills stood, his face pale. "Get those cuffs off. Now." Kira hesitated, her hands suddenly heavy. She fumbled with the keys. The metallic click that followed sounded different this time, not like control, but like release. Judge Hayes rubbed his wrists, the red marks vivid against his skin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He simply looked at Kira, and that calm, wounded gaze was worse than any rebuke. "Officer," he said quietly, "I tried to tell you." Kira's throat tightened. "Sir? I didn't." "You didn't listen." The words were soft, but they landed like thunder. Minutes later, the hallway was a storm of motion, phone calls, supervisors, murmurs of internal affairs. The security footage was being pulled. Every camera angle, every second, archived. Kira stood frozen by her desk as the reality set in. Her training manual hadn't prepared her for this part, for the silence that follows after the gun isn't fired, but a soul still gets wounded. She looked down at her reflection in the glass of her report monitor. Her own face looked older now, the weight of uniform and doubt pressing down. Behind her, Mills spoke quietly into the radio. "Notify the chief. We've got an officer-involved incident, correction, judicial assault." Those last two words would echo across the department like a storm rolling in. And inside the holding room, Judge Hayes closed his eyes, whispering a single sentence, half prayer, half resolve. "Let the truth be seen, even through the blindfold." By afternoon, the courthouse had turned into a storm of whispers. Every corridor echoed with questions that no one wanted to answer. Outside, reporters were already gathering, cameras hungry for a story, a black federal judge assaulted by a white officer on his own courthouse steps. Inside, Chief Judge Elena Ramirez stood in her office, arms crossed, watching the footage for the 5th time. The video didn't lie. It showed every second, the slap, the handcuffs, the mocking laughter, the badge glinting in the sun. "Good God," she whispered. Across from her sat Special Agent Paul Kent from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. He had seen hundreds of misconduct cases, but this one was different. Judge Hayes filed the preservation order himself, minutes after the arrest, Kent said, sliding a document across the desk. He anticipated everything. Ramirez nodded slowly. He's been investigating patterns of bias in this department for months. It seems the investigation just found him instead. Downstairs, Officer Kira Sloan sat alone in the interview room. Her uniform jacket was folded on the table. She'd been read her rights, something she'd done to others countless times, but never imagined hearing herself. The two FBI agents across from her were calm, methodical. "Officer Sloan, we've reviewed your body cam footage," Agent Kent began. "Would you like to explain why you reported a malfunction?" Kira swallowed hard. I thought it stopped recording." "It didn't." He tapped the tablet. The audio filled the room, her voice, sharp and unguarded. "Look at this uppity guy thinking he can walk wherever he wants." Each word hit her like a stone. She couldn't even recognize her own voice anymore. "That wasn't. I didn't mean." Kent's gaze was steady, not cruel. "Intent doesn't erase impact, officer. Especially when your words carry the weight of a badge." Kira looked down at her hands. For the first time, she noticed how they were trembling, not from fear of punishment, but from the dawning realization of what she had become without even noticing. Meanwhile, in a quiet conference room, Judge Hayes sat across from Chief Judge Ramirez. The bruise on his face was fading, but the gravity in his eyes was sharper than ever. "I'm not pressing personal charges," he said. "But the system must answer for itself." Ramirez nodded. "You understand what that means. Once this becomes federal, it won't stop with her." "It shouldn't." Hayes replied simply. "Accountability isn't vengeance. It's light." There was silence for a moment, the kind that hums with the weight of truth. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the marble. News vans lined the street. Protesters began to gather, some holding signs that read, "Justice is not blind, she's just looking away." And inside, Officer Kira Sloan sat staring at the table. The same sunlight that once glinted on her badge now touched her empty hands. For the first time, she understood what it meant to be seen, truly seen, and judged not by what you say, but by what you do. In the flickering half-light of evening, truth had finally stepped out of the shadows. The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of cameras. It wasn't just another disciplinary hearing, it was a national moment. Across the oak-paneled room sat Officer Kira Sloan, her uniform traded for a gray suit, hands folded tightly. Across from her, behind the elevated bench, sat Judge Malcolm Hayes, the bruise on his cheek almost gone but the memory of it etched deep into everyone's mind. Reporters filled the gallery. Attorneys lined the aisles. And for the first time in her career, Kira was the one being called to the stand. The clerk's voice broke the silence. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Malcolm L. Hayes presiding. Everyone stood. Everyone except Kira, whose legs felt too heavy to obey. When Hayes spoke, his tone was measured, deliberate, the voice of justice tempered by humanity. "Officer Sloan," he began, "you stand before this court not as an enemy, but as a reflection." Kira's head lifted slightly. "For years, I believed the system corrected itself, that law alone could cleanse prejudice. I was wrong. Because the law is a mirror, officer. It only reflects the face that looks into it." He gestured toward the projection screen. "Let's watch." The footage played again, the same clip that had traveled across every network in America. Her words. Her tone. The slap that reverberated through a nation. The silence that followed was suffocating. When it ended, Hayes spoke softly. "Do you recognize this person, officer?" "Yes," she whispered. "Who is she?" Kira hesitated. Her throat tightened. "She was me, before I saw what I was doing." A ripple of sound moved through the gallery, the sound of people breathing again. Hayes nodded slowly. "I believe accountability should teach, not destroy. You will face judgment, not of vengeance, but of truth." He looked to the court reporter. "Let the record reflect that this hearing is not a trial of one officer, but of a culture, one that confuses fear with duty." From the back row, Agent Ken observed silently. He'd seen punishment deliver silence. But this was different. It was transformation being written into record. Hayes continued. "You asked, Officer Sloan, why this happened to you. It didn't happen to you. It happened through you. The system spoke using your voice, and now, it must learn to listen." Kira's eyes glistened. "I understand, Your Honor." "Do you?" he asked quietly. "Because understanding without change is just another form of denial." She nodded, unable to speak. Hayes leaned back slightly, his voice now softer, not judicial, but human. "When you saw me that morning, what did you see?" Kira hesitated. "A threat," she admitted. "Not because of what you did, but because of what I've been taught to fear." A murmur filled the courtroom. Hayes let it settle. "And now," he asked. "Now I see a man I should have respected before I ever spoke." For a moment, the courtroom was completely still, suspended between shame and grace. Hayes nodded once. "Then maybe, for the first time, the law is beginning to see too." The gavel struck once, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in applause. Some cried, some simply stood in silence. Because for the first time in a long time, they hadn't witnessed a fall, they'd witnessed a reckoning that still believed in redemption. And above the courthouse doors, the sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the words carved in stone. Equal justice under law. The weeks that followed felt like the slow exhale of a city holding its breath. Headlines came and went. Debates raged on cable news. But beneath the noise, something quieter was happening, something that couldn't be measured in ratings or polls. Inside the Northgate Police Department, mandatory bias training sessions began. Old posters came down. New words went up: integrity, awareness, accountability. But for Kira Sloan, the real training was silence, learning how to sit with what she'd done and what it meant. She was reassigned to community liaison duty. No badge on her chest, no weapon on her belt. Just a name tag and the responsibility of listening. Every morning, she walked the same steps where it had all begun. The courthouse looked different now, not because it had changed, but because she had. One afternoon, she saw Judge Hayes leaving the building. He paused when he saw her. For a moment, neither spoke. "Good afternoon, Judge," she said softly. "Officer Sloan," he replied, a hint of a smile beneath his calm tone. "How's the work treating you?" "Hard," she admitted. "But honest." He nodded. "That's all justice ever asks of us, honesty. Even when it hurts." The two stood in the golden afternoon light, the same place where months earlier everything had fallen apart. Now, it felt different, warmer, quieter, almost repaired. "You know," Hayes said after a pause, "people think justice lives in courtrooms. But it really lives in what we do when no one's watching." Kira looked down. "I'm still learning how to see clearly." "So am I," he said gently. "We all are." He turned to leave, then stopped and glanced back. "The light's better in the mornings, officer. Makes the world a little easier to see." And with that, he walked away, his briefcase in hand, the same one that had once fallen to the ground with a sound she'd never forget. Weeks later, the city released its official report. The conclusion was simple, almost poetic. Justice is not blind. She sees through the eyes of those willing to open them. Across Northgate, murals appeared on brick walls. One showed a figure standing between light and shadow, half in uniform, half in robes. Underneath, 3 words in bold white paint. See. Listen. Change. In her small apartment, Kira kept a copy of that report on her desk. She'd underlined a single line. Accountability begins where excuses end. She whispered it sometimes, like a prayer, before heading out to her shift. At the same hour, in his chambers, Judge Hayes adjusted his robe before a new hearing. For the first time in months, his reflection in the glass no longer looked tired, just aware. He thought of that morning, the sound of metal and fear, and how easily light could become a weapon. But he also thought of what had followed, how light could heal if held steady long enough. Outside, the courthouse bells rang. Another day. Another chance. And this time, perhaps, justice would remember. Morning came softly. The kind of morning that didn't ask for forgiveness, it simply offered another chance. Sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows, warm and quiet, settling on the marble floor where once a man had fallen and a system had stumbled. Judge Malcolm Hayes stood in his chambers, robe draped over one arm, a cup of coffee in the other. The world outside was stirring again, footsteps, voices, the hum of a city learning how to see itself. On his desk lay a small envelope. No return address. Inside, a folded note written in uneven handwriting. "Thank you for not giving up on me. I don't know if I'll ever earn forgiveness. But I promise to spend every day trying. Kira." He smiled, not the smile of triumph, but of quiet understanding. He placed the note beside his gavel, under the small brass plate engraved with his name. Outside his window, the same steps where it all began glowed in the first light of dawn. People were walking freely again. No shouting. No fear. Just movement, ordinary and sacred at once. In another part of the city, Kira Sloan zipped up her community outreach jacket. She pinned a small pin to her collar, not the old badge of authority, but a simple circle of intertwined hands. Her first stop that morning was a high school. She stood before a group of teenagers, some curious, some skeptical, and began to speak. "When I wore my badge," she said, "I thought it made me right. But a badge doesn't make you right, it gives you a choice. The choice to protect, or to punish. And sometimes, you don't see the difference until it's too late." The students were silent, listening. And for the first time in a long time, Kira didn't feel like she was defending herself, she was telling the truth. Later that day, she walked by the courthouse again. Tourists were taking pictures. Children were chasing pigeons across the marble. She stopped at the bronze plaque by the entrance. It was new, polished, gleaming in the sun. The inscription read, "Here, on these steps, justice learned to see." She reached out and touched the cool metal. For a brief moment, her reflection shimmered on its surface, her face framed by light. "Keep learning," she whispered to it, and smiled. That night, the city was calm. No sirens, no protests, just the low hum of streetlights and the rhythm of life continuing. Judge Hayes sat by his window, watching the skyline. The courthouse clock struck 10, its chime echoing across the quiet streets. He thought of all the faces he'd seen in that courtroom, guilty, innocent, afraid, defiant. And he realized something he'd always known but never fully felt. Justice doesn't live in verdicts. It lives in what happens after. He lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast, not to victory, but to vision. "Here's to the light," he murmured. "May it never forget where it came from." The camera of memory pulls back. The courthouse, bathed in gold. The city breathing. A world, imperfect, unfinished, still learning how to see. And then, as the screen fades to black, his voice returns one last time. "Justice is blind, yes. But maybe that's because she's still opening her eyes."